welcome to the deep dive, where we like to say a little knowledge goes a long way. Today, we're diving into the world of caregiving.
Caregiving.
But through a lens you might not expect, we're talking boundaries.
That's right.
And to help guide us through this kind of often overlooked aspect of caregiving, we are turning to Chapter 7 of Dr. Warwick Cooper's book, My Turn to Care, Effective Caring for Those You Love.
Yeah, his book really helps people rethink a lot of the typical advice you hear, and he really explores how maintaining those healthy boundaries isn't just about self-preservation. It's actually the key to stronger, healthier relationships with your loved ones, the people that you're caring for.
Okay, so boundaries equal stronger relationships. All right, I'll admit, you've got my attention.
Yeah.
Where does Dr. Cooper even begin with this?
Well, he starts with a really interesting anecdote about a headmaster in India who is playfully nicknamed Mr. Stinky by one of his students.
Mr. Stinky. Okay, you definitely have my attention. What is the story there?
Yeah, so it's a lighthearted example, but it highlights how even in a simple interaction, right, the need for respect and boundaries is universal. And the headmaster used this experience to teach his students about understanding personal space and, kind of respecting each other's boundaries.
Oh, I love that.
Yeah.
It's such a clear example of how boundaries aren't about creating walls or being rigid, but they're really about fostering mutual respect and understanding.
Exactly. And that's a theme that runs throughout the entire chapter.
Okay.
Dr. Cooper emphasizes that setting boundaries is not selfish. It's actually a form of love.
Because,
by setting boundaries, you're ensuring a sustainable and respectful relationship. Imagine, right, saying no to an additional caregiving task. I mean, it's tough, but it allows you to show up fully energized for the commitments you've already made to your loved ones. And that's a really powerful example of how respecting your own limits, it ultimately benefits everyone involved.
That's such a good point, because I think we often associate boundaries with saying no.
Right.
And it feels inherently negative.
Yeah.
But you're right. It's about creating a sustainable space for both people in the relationship to thrive.
Precisely. It's about understanding where one person ends and the other begins. And Dr. Cooper, he even compares it to helping someone who's stuck in quicksand.
Ooh, I remember that analogy. What was it again?
So he says, you can't help someone out of quicksand if you get pulled in too.
Right.
You need to be on solid ground yourself to even be able to offer a hand.
That makes so much sense.
Oh.
So it's not selfish to prioritize your well-being as a caregiver.
No.
In fact, it's essential for providing effective care.
Yeah, exactly.
In the long run.
And that's where the different types of boundaries come in.
Okay.
Dr. Cooper dives into emotional, intellectual, and spiritual boundaries, all crucial in the context of caregiving.
So it's not just about physical space, but it's about setting limits emotionally, intellectually, and even spiritually. I'm really curious to unpack those different types. Can you give me an example of what, say, an emotional boundary might look like in a caregiving situation?
Absolutely. Let's say you're caring for an aging parent who is struggling with a lot of anxiety about their health. You can empathize with their fears and be a source of support without internalizing all of their anxieties yourself.
So it's about setting limits on how much you absorb emotionally. It's like having empathy, but with healthy emotional guardrails.
Yes, exactly. And then when it comes to intellectual boundaries, it's about recognizing that you and your loved one might have different viewpoints or beliefs.
Okay.
Even about their care.
Can you give me a real-world example of that?
Yeah, so let's say your aging parent, who's always been fiercely independent, insists on managing their finances despite showing, signs of forgetfulness. Respecting their intellectual boundaries means having a conversation about your concerns, right, while still honoring their desire to maintain some control. It's a delicate balance.
That's a really helpful example. It's about respecting their autonomy and right to make decisions, even if you don't fully agree with them.
Exactly. And then there are spiritual boundaries, which can be even more nuanced.
Okay, spiritual boundaries. I think we need to dedicate some time to unpack that one. What exactly do those look like? Give me the deep dive on spiritual boundaries.
Yeah, you're right. Spiritual boundaries are definitely unique. It's about respecting your loved one's spiritual needs and preferences without imposing your own.
Okay, that makes sense. But how do you actually do that? It seems tricky, especially when we're dealing with, emotionally charged situations.
You're absolutely right. It requires a lot of sensitivity and awareness. Let's say, for example, your loved one, they find comfort in prayer.
Yeah.
Respecting their spiritual boundaries might mean offering to pray with them, if that aligns with their beliefs,
Right.
but never, forcing it upon them or using it as a way to impose your own spiritual views.
So it's about meeting them where they are on their spiritual journey, not about trying to like lead them down your own path.
Precisely. Recognizing that everyone's spiritual journey is unique and deserves to be honored, especially in, the vulnerable space of caregiving.
That's a really beautiful way to put it. It strikes me that with all three of these boundaries, emotional, intellectual, and spiritual, it's really about recognizing the other person's autonomy. Like it's about supporting them in a way that empowers them rather than diminishes their sense of self.
That's a really insightful observation, and I think it's at the heart of what Dr. Cooper is getting at. It's about saying, I'm here to support you in a way that honors who you are, not who I think you should be.
I love that.
Yeah.
So we've covered why boundaries are essential and then what the different types look like. But I have to ask, how do we actually like set these boundaries? Especially when we're dealing with loved ones.
Right.
Those conversations can feel so daunting.
You're right. It is definitely easier said than done. But thankfully, Dr. Cooper provides some really practical tips. He has like a whole section titled How to Set Healthy Boundaries. And it's full of really useful advice. And one of the key takeaways for me is the importance of clear communication.
So no more hinting around or hoping our loved ones will just magically pick up on our unspoken needs.
Exactly. Yeah, he really stresses the importance of, expressing your needs and expectations directly.
Okay.
Using I statements, right, that focus on how certain situations make you feel rather than like blaming or accusing the other person.
Can you give me an example? I think it would be helpful to like hear it in practice.
Absolutely. So instead of saying, you're always demanding too much, try something like, I feel overwhelmed when I'm asked to do so many things at once. Can we maybe prioritize a few things for now?
It's so much better.
Yeah.
It takes the focus off attacking the other person
Yeah.
and puts it on your own experience. It feels more like a collaborative conversation.
Exactly. It's about working together to find solutions that work for everyone.
Yeah.
And Dr. Cooper also talks about the importance of setting realistic expectations, both for ourselves as caregivers, right, but also for the people that we're caring for.
It's like they say, you can't pour from an empty cup.
Yes.
Caregivers often put everyone else's needs before their own. And that's like a recipe for burnout.
You're absolutely right. And he really stresses that, self-care isn't selfish. It's essential to be a better caregiver in the long run.
Yeah.
And he encourages readers to actually schedule time for themselves, whether it's a hobby, exercise, or just some quiet time to recharge.
And sometimes that might mean saying no to certain requests, right?
Exactly. And that can be one of the toughest things for caregivers to do.
Yeah.
But it's crucial.
Because we don't want to disappoint our loved ones. And there's often guilt involved.
Absolutely. And he addresses those common fears head on. He talks about the fear of rejection, the fear of conflict, and the fear of guilt, all very real emotions that caregivers, grapple with.
So how does he suggest we deal with those fears? Let's say I'm terrified of saying no because I don't want to seem uncaring or like burden someone else.
Yeah.
What do I do with that?
That's such a common fear. And Dr. Cooper reminds us that healthy relationships are built on mutual respect, not on one person constantly sacrificing their needs to please the other.
Yeah.
And he also offers some really practical tips for saying no gracefully,
Okay.
like offering alternatives or, maybe suggesting someone else who might be able to help.
That's really helpful. It's not about just like shutting down the request, but it's about acknowledging it and finding solutions together.
Yeah.
What about the fear of conflict?
Yeah.
Sometimes even the thought of a difficult conversation makes me want to avoid, setting boundaries altogether.
I hear you. But remember, as we were saying earlier, setting those boundaries, even when it's uncomfortable, it's actually a form of love.
Right.
And Dr. Cooper emphasizes that avoiding conflict entirely, it often leads to resentment and even bigger problems down the line.
It's like that saying, resentment is like drinking poison and waiting for the other person to die.
Exactly. And it's important to address issues openly and honestly, focusing on, shared goals and finding solutions together. And he gives some really good tips on having those difficult conversations constructively, which I think is, so valuable.
It's almost like he's giving us the tools to be better communicators overall, not just in the context of caregiving.
Absolutely. And finally, for those struggling with guilt, and let's face it, guilt is practically a caregiver's middle name.
Right.
Dr. Cooper offers a really interesting perspective. He says, boundaries aren't just about excluding things, but also consciously including things that nourish and support us.
Wait, I love that. So it's not just about saying no, but it's also about saying yes to ourselves and our well-being.
Exactly. He encourages us to really ask ourselves, what do I need to feel healthy, balanced, and energized in my caregiving journey?
Right.
What do I need to include in my life?
It's about shifting our mindset from I have to do this to I choose to do this while also taking care of myself.
Hmm.
But even with all the best intentions and strategies, sometimes boundaries get crossed, right? What happens then?
Yeah, and that's such a good question. What happens when boundaries get crossed? Because, right, we're all human, and even with, the best intentions, things can get messy.
Totally.
Yeah, and Dr. Cooper, he reminds us that even when boundaries do get crossed, it's not a failure.
Okay.
It's an opportunity to kind of reaffirm those boundaries, have those open and honest conversations, and maybe even, adjust them as needed.
So it's an ongoing process.
Exactly.
It's not a one-and-done conversation.
Yeah, and it requires flexibility and understanding from both sides. And he also talks about, the importance of recognizing the signs that maybe our boundaries are getting blurred a little bit, right? Like feeling constantly overwhelmed or resentful, having difficulty saying no, or neglecting our own needs and relationships.
Those are great red flags to look out for. It's like a little internal alarm system.
Yeah.
He also touches on a really interesting distinction between servanthood and servitude in caregiving.
Yes. That's one of the most powerful parts of the chapter, in my opinion.
Yeah.
He talks about how, unhealthy boundaries can lead to these feeling trapped in these cycles of resentment and exhaustion, which ultimately helps no one.
Right.
And he uses a scenario where one sibling ends up shouldering the entire burden of caring for, aging parents, while the other siblings kind of remain relatively uninvolved.
Yeah.
And it leads to so much resentment towards, the siblings who aren't involved, resentment towards the parent. It becomes a lose-lose situation for everyone.
It's heartbreaking, but it is so common, isn't it?
It is.
We want to help, we love our family, but without those healthy boundaries, it can be so draining and damaging.
It really can. And Dr. Cooper emphasizes that, true servanthood, the kind of love and service, modeled by Christ, it's rooted in love, not obligation or resentment.
It's such an important distinction. It's about choosing to serve from a place of wholeness, not from a place of depletion.
Yes.
And that's where those healthy boundaries come in.
Absolutely.
They allow us to show up for our loved ones with more love and energy because we're also taking care of ourselves in the process.
Exactly. Recognizing that we can't pour from an empty cup.
Mm-hmm.
And when we prioritize our own well-being, physically, emotionally, intellectually, spiritually, we're actually better equipped to care for others in a sustainable and loving way.
This has been such an eye-opening conversation.
Yeah.
We've explored why boundaries are essential in caregiving, how to set them, how to deal with those common fears that hold us back, and even how to recognize when those boundaries might need some readjusting.
Absolutely. Such an important conversation.
And we've learned that setting those boundaries isn't selfish. It's actually an act of love.
Yes.
For ourselves and for the people we care for. And speaking of love, Dr. Cooper ends the chapter with this beautiful image of clothing ourselves in love.
I love that.
He says that's the key to harmonious, sustainable caregiving.
It is.
And he leaves us with a powerful question to ponder.
Okay.
What does it look like to wear your boundaries in a way that feels both strong and compassionate?
Ooh, that's a good one. I like that.
That's something I'm going to be reflecting on.
Yeah.
This deep dive has given me a lot to think about, not just in, my caregiving roles, but in all my relationships.
Me too, for sure. It's a good reminder that respecting our own needs and limitations, it allows us to show up more fully for everyone else.
So well said. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into the transformative power of boundaries in caregiving.
Absolutely.
Until next time, remember to care for yourselves as fiercely as you care for others.